Robert Destro. I go by Bob, and my title is Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I work at the State Department. My most recent title is Special Coordinator for Tibet Issues, and I started this job in September of 2019.
All right. How's it been so far?
It's been absolutely fascinating.
I'll bet it has.
It's a really interesting job, and of course complicated quite a bit because 6 months into the job, everybody went home and was working virtually.
Right. Now, do you go into the quote office at all now?
Yes, I do. I'm usually in there about easily 5 days a week. Maybe not the whole day.
Uh-huh.
I'll go in tomorrow morning. I've got to go in and be there for an 8 o'clock, interview. And, but most days I'll go in sometime late in the morning.
Okay. So I've known you since you were a young kid, and in fact, since we were both young kids.
Yeah, oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and I know your sisters, and I know your mom and dad. But my curiosity is, I know your dad was the police captain in Akron, Ohio, correct? And
Correct.
I've always wondered when you chose law, if that your dad's occupation somehow influenced what you wanted to do, or if that was totally independent of that.
I think it was largely independent.
Okay.
Uh, the, I don't think we had a couple of very interesting conversations about it afterwards. But if you had asked me when I was in high school and college, what do you really want to do when you grow up?
Uh-huh.
I would have said I want to be a diplomat.
Really?
Yes.
And you finally achieved it.
I finally achieved it, and I wanted to be a diplomat, and what the route I chose to get to it was through international human rights law,
Okay.
or through human rights. And so I came at it. If you ask me, like, why did you go to law school?
Right.
The short answer would have been it seemed like the logical thing to do at the time.
Okay.
I mean, I was a political science major who,
Uh-huh.
I majored in political science and Russian.
Okay.
And, but, at least at the time, the, they still tell people if you didn't go to an Ivy League school, then, don't waste your time applying for the State Department.
Really?
And that they still tell people that. It's less true, but one of the big issues today is diversity and inclusion, and it's a pretty you have to getting in the foreign service is very much you know where you went to school, kind of what if I looked around the building and saw where people went to graduate school, there's a certain path that you can kind of predict.
Right. Now, did you go to an Ivy League school?
No, I went to Miami of Ohio for undergraduate, and I went to the University of California at Berkeley for law school, with an intermediate year at the University of Akron Law School.
Now, did they consider Berkeley on par with the other quote Ivy League schools? Because I would have.
Well, it's funny. One of my colleagues, who started at the State Department, uh, at about the time I graduated from law, just around the time I graduated from law school. He's a couple of years older than me, and they hired him, and they hired a colleague of his from Stanford. So you had a Berkeley and a Stanford, and they considered them to be completely esoteric at the time.
Really?
Yes,
That is
absolutely.
amazing.
And they actually put them in the same office. If you want to talk about stereotyping, I mean, I wasn't
You
there.
guys go over
But
here, right?
yeah, I mean, it really is. It can be a very, um, insular place.
That's interesting. So you went to law school. What did you do immediately after law school?
After law school, I went to a big law firm in Cleveland.
Okay.
Uh, I thought I wanted to practice securities law, because I had done an internship unpaid, I might add. I got credit for it at the Securities and Exchange Commission in San Francisco,
Okay.
which I loved. I mean, it was a great thing. And so I translated that into an interest in securities law. What I actually did was enforcement, which is very much like cops and robbers.
Mm-hmm.
When I got to the law firm, they put me in an area I never thought of, which was labor law,
Oh,
and
interesting.
primarily public sector labor. So we actually represented teachers, school boards, you know, labor arbitrations. I mean, all that, which I fell in love with. And,
Okay.
and then they put me in the actual issuer securities part,
Well,
and I thought I was going to die. I was so bored.
well, you've got a couple of great experiences then that touches on a couple of our topics, which is one is business ethics. Securities laws really have played a big role in business ethics, haven't they?
Oh, huge. Absolutely. That's, you have Sarbanes-Oxley, and, and among other things, when I teach at law school, I teach legal ethics. And
Uh,
so that crosses over into those topics. Sure.
Now, have you seen that as a result of both your experience as well as your involvement with businesses, that ethics has continued to play a more important role in business in general in the American workplace?
Huge.
Has it?
Absolutely huge. Yeah. In fact, one of my best friends from law school for many years worked for a nonprofit as in the counsel's office.
Okay.
And then they had the bright idea that they would fire everybody and outsource. And so he went to a huge law firm, and his specialty is intellectual property.
Hmm.
And so we were talking one day, and I said, "Well, how do you like it?" He says, "I hate it." I said, "I said why?" I said, "Why?" He says, "I spend all day doing the stuff that you like to do." He says, "I don't get to do any intellectual property because I spend all day fly specking ethics things, because the
Uh,
people who invest their venture capital in this particular field," he says, "it's like flushing your money down the toilet." He
I'll be
says, "If
done.
we make any ethical mistake, they're going to come back against us." So he says, "I'd rather hire you to do the ethics stuff and just do what needs to be done, in the field that I really like." So
Right.
eventually, he then left the law firm and went back in house to a big company.
Interesting. Well, there's pretty clear evidence too that recent studies have indicated that those companies that have been major practitioners in improvement in their ethical behavior actually outperform companies who haven't put a focus on that. In the Fortune 500 companies, the recent statistics said that those more ethical companies have a return of 11.6% versus those that are less ethical of only 6%. So it tells you something in there about, integrity and ethics.
Well, no, I just had this conversation this afternoon with one of our people. I mean, she just celebrated her 50th anniversary at the State Department. I mean,
Wow.
she's just an amazing person. And and we were talking about this whole idea of diversity and inclusion.
Hmm.
Well, everybody thinks this is such esoteric stuff. This is basic ethics. It's
Absolutely.
you be nice. You tell the truth.
Right.
You take you take your time with people, and you get to know what they can do, what they can't do. But it really starts at the top. And so when a company has problems, say with sexual harassment, or somebody who is kind of robbing the company blind.
Right.
I mean, it's either because nobody's looking or nobody cared.
Well, in addition to that, though, talk about starting at the top. Whatever that leader exhibits in terms of behavior, others feel it's okay for them to do the same thing.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so it really does trickle down the organization.
Yeah, no, it does, and it's the way in which the leaders approach these questions when they hear something, something that went wrong.
Uh,
you have to look at.
yep. In terms of laws, you've probably seen, you talked about being involved in labor laws and stuff. There's been a lot of developments in labor laws during both of our mutual careers. What are some of the most significant ones that you've seen, Bob, come along and have really had a positive impact as a consequence?
Well, there's really two main areas of labor law. There's what we call the kind of the private sector. This is where you get into the union management, labor management issues.
Right.
That's an area that I've been less involved in.
Okay.
Um, I was primarily involved in the employment law side,
Okay.
which is the employment discrimination, sex discrimination, hostile environments, those
Gotcha.
kinds of things.
Right.
And then lately, I mean, at the State Department, they were all really thrilled, when they said, "Oh my gosh, here's, our bureau is democracy, human rights, and labor, and we've never actually had a labor guy." So they were very happy with that.
Right.
But the stuff that I've been involved in since I started almost is the labor supply chains, when you look at slave labor in a supply chain,
Uh-huh.
and how that ripples its way through the economic system, depresses wages. I mean, do you really want, for example, to buy a discounted, T-shirt, with a sports logo on it if you find out that it was made in Xinjiang with cotton, grown by slave laborers?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
those are huge, huge issues.
Well, you got the slave labor, you've also got the child labor issues as well
Yep,
on top of that.
child labor. We also wind up actually dealing with one of the things in our portfolio is child soldiers, which is a labor aspect most people don't think about.
Right.
So there's plenty of issues out there.
Wow. Yeah, things that I wouldn't normally think of just because they're not readily apparent in the United States.
No, no,
Not that
no,
not that
no.
they don't exist, I might add, but just not readily apparent.
Well, it's interesting when you go back because I teach, among other things, constitutional law. You go back and you see that during the first, probably anywhere from 1890 to roughly 1940,
Uh-huh.
was the big era of labor law and constitutional law. Where you got Congress didn't have, at least under the way the court looked at it back then, didn't have the authority to stop child labor.
Right.
We've now done that directly, but they could say, well, you can't ship furniture made by child labor in interstate commerce. So the social pressure causes a workaround in any event.
Well, and the time frame you just talked about was subsequent to the Industrial Revolution that really brought production and brought craftsmanship into manufacturing, and our whole farming system. Everybody converted over. The major labor shift went into production, and therefore it was all about minimizing the cost of labor per unit of output.
Exactly, and that's what if COVID has taught us anything, it's that just-in-time delivery. If you start disrupting a supply chain,
Right.
for whatever reason, whether it's people got sick, or you find slave labor in it,
Yeah.
and the Labor Department says, or the Homeland Security says you're not importing it, so it's all going to sit on the dock.
Right.
That's serious business.
Oh yeah. Was that what caused our toilet paper shortage?
Actually, there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal about that,
Uh-huh.
and it turns out that the companies that make paper towels and toilet paper are predominantly in Georgia,
Okay.
and because it's close to all the pulpwood and
Right.
everything, and the machines, they basically just kind of stay ahead of what seasonal demand is, but you can't readily
Ramp up.
switch the ramp up. Yeah, I mean, you could run it 24/7 and still not keep up with people hoarding it.
Right.
And there's not that much other capacity, and you're not going to fly in paper towels from China.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. How about cultural changes that you've seen in our workplace? Things that, and I'll give you an example of a cultural change. When I was with PepsiCo, when I first started, in fact, most of my early business, I go to work in a three-piece suit. Now fast forward to today, I'm sitting here having a meeting with you in a polo shirt, but I've got shorts and sandals on. So a major shift. But at PepsiCo, our uniform, literally, it was a uniform, was a three-piece suit, blue, white shirt like yourself, red tie. And whenever the CEO came in, couldn't distinguish one of us from the other. I mean, it was just a sea of red, white, and blue.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's the way the law firm was.
Yeah, I'll bet.
I mean, and it was, there are allegations. I mean, if you looked at the old movie 9 to 5,
Uh-huh.
I mean, there are people who say that that was based on a law firm, not not a business.
Right.
I know of situations in which, at least in one situation where at a different law firm, they caught the partner sending the associate out of town, and he was having an affair with the associate's wife.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, and when they complained about it, they fired the associate.
Of course.
And of course there was a big revolution. I mean, finally, it got sorted out.
Right.
But I think one of the biggest cultural changes is that people are being forced to take responsibility more.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I still hear it in, well, I'm sorry, if I caused any offense, I'm sorry. And my reaction is, why are you being such a moral coward? Just say you're sorry that, they screwed things up,
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, the other cultural changes that I'm seeing too, and it has a lot to do with expectations of employees, is that because employees, especially Gen Y, are requiring us to be more thoughtful about inclusion, but also about their involvement and their desire to see a bigger platform for the business other than profit. They want to see businesses that have a social conscious, not just a profit orientation. I don't know if you've experienced that in your endeavors along the way.
I have on any number of occasions. Let's start with the inclusion part.
Okay.
Okay. That's a conversation which I'm actively involved right now.
Okay.
And what I have seen in many instances, I certainly have seen this in kind of the academy as well, is when you say to somebody, okay, so what makes a good law professor? And they say, well, they write a lot. I say, yeah, but what does that have to actually do with teaching?
Right.
What does the scholarship have to do with teaching? And I see that in my office. I sent out a memo, that we wanted to have a diversity and inclusion council. And I said, we're going to have one, but we're not going to engage in a lot of, debates.
Uh-huh.
What we're going to do is I'm going to teach you what the phrase BFOQ means. And BFOQ is a labor law term. It means bona fide occupational qualification.
Okay.
And I said, so you have here is the job description, right?
All right.
Now, what I want to know is, once you've winnowed people out during the way the federal government does stuff,
okay,
right, which is, by the way, is problematic, I might add.
Are you amazed you made it through the maze?
Well, I came in as a political.
Okay.
And I'll tell a story about that in a different afterwards. But I said, all right, they've made it through what we call the cert, the certification.
Right.
All right, so now you're going to interview them. What are you looking for? I want you to give me 5 things that you expect, a foreign service officer 03. Okay, what do they do? What 5 things? If they can't do if they can't do all 5 of those, we're not even going to consider them.
Right.
That is a real stumper for certain people. I mean,
That's interesting.
it to law faculty. I said, if we ever had to take your deposition, and put you under oath and said, why did you vote for somebody or against somebody? Did you actually read their scholarship, or did you rely on what the committee said?
Yeah.
It's like, well, how, who are you to ask me these questions? I said, if I sued you, I would be, I would have your lunch. So I mean, this is and what I find is that most people want to do the right thing.
I agree with you there. I agree with you 100%.
Just like you were saying earlier, nobody ever trains you on, well, what does it mean to be a manager?
Yeah.
I mean, basically give you a job and say, okay, go do it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no assistant secretary 101 class. I mean, and what I was going to tell you earlier is when I went into the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with the minority staff. So that would have been Senator Menendez and the Democrat staff.
Okay.
We went through the whole thing. They were asking all kinds of questions and but back in the corner, off to my left, behind the staff, were the summer interns. And so after they were all done, I said, well, you never let them ask any questions. They said, could we do that? And I said, sure, why not? And they said, how do you get a job like this? And that comes back to networking and
oh yeah,
who you did favor. I mean, it's how do you get most jobs? It's people who and people who say, oh, I think you would be pretty good at that kind of a job. You can actually get things done.
Right.
I mean, those kinds of questions.
Almost all of the position I've got in the last, I'd say 20 years, were because of people who knew me and either referred me or hired me when they moved on.
Right.
And it really made a difference. It really made a significant difference. Back to something you said about employees in general. I have a personal philosophy whenever anybody has a comment about workers today at any generational, there aren't any people, I won't say any, but 99% of people in my philosophy come to work to do a good job. They don't come to work to do a bad job. It's our responsibility as managers to ensure that they have the ability and the tools to do that good job. And if they don't, it's our responsibility, not theirs, because we failed them, not the other way around.
No, so that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's really a shame because managers don't take that responsibility. They figure, you screwed up, you're gone, I'll just get the next person to come in and do it.
Well, but that's part of that ethical dimension,
right?
Is that people are not commodities, and that I think the last time I checked, it's been a while, but I think it was only about 11% of businesses invest seriously in the kind of training that they need to.
That doesn't surprise me.
That could be off, but you spend more on maintenance of your office equipment than you do on, and it just even sitting around with people and say, okay, we got to pick. In my office, we're going to have to hire about 7 or 8 full-time equivalent positions because the inspector general got all over us because we weren't administering the money the way we should.
Okay.
And I should add a caveat that happened before I got there.
And now you have to take care of it.
Yeah, no, I have to take care of it. But
right.
That was the conversation. If we hire what we call a grant officer representative, what does one do? There's the official job description, but it doesn't tell you, what a really good one would be like.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you know that is by talking to people and say, okay, so what do you do?
Right.
If you could be free to be even better at your job, than you are, what would you do?
Yeah.
And most of them say I'd get on a plane and I'd go out in the field and I'd find out, how the money's getting spent. And I'd look at the books and, it's a very active management oversight kind of a job.
Right. So a lot of people, I think they assume I'll know one when I see one, as opposed to I know what it takes to be successful.
Well, I would be a little bit more cynical.
Oh.
I would probably say I know one who looks like me.
Ah, very good point. Absolutely.
Who went
Absolutely.
to the same kind of school that I went to.
Right.
It's not necessarily a look. It's like, well, politically, they're more like me. I mean,
Yeah.
what people are doing is they're kind of scanning the crowd for people that they think they can get along with.
But how do you get past that? Because that's one of the things that I'm interested in your point of view about, is if you were to create an ideal world where there was equal opportunity for all, and I know that's a tall order, what were some of the fundamental things that would have to change in our workplace to achieve that objective?
Well, I think that I think that managers would have to rethink about what management means. I mean, part of it is, I mean, if you were going out and buying a new piece of property or buying some big machine tool,
Right.
you'd have a whole staff researching and is this the best deal? And we don't do that with people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you really, I mean, do you leave this in the hands of the HR staff? I don't think you should. The
Right.
HR staff is designed to kind of set things up for you. But at the end of the day, the senior management team has to decide, is this the kind of a person we're looking for?
Right.
And the big cut on the State Department was that it was always Ivy League. Well, I mean, that doesn't represent America. I mean, I remember I mean, I'm sure, there's a lot of really smart people, who went to the Ivy League, and I
Right.
don't, and I know a bunch of them,
Uh,
but the fact is there are people who are really smart who went to the University of Georgia and UC San Diego
mhm.
and Loma Linda and all the different places in between, and not everybody has the same opportunities that everybody has.
That's
So
exactly right.
so the real meaning of affirmative action is to get out there and beat the bushes and say, have you thought about coming to work at the State Department? I mean, most people would say, I didn't know I could do that.
Right. Well, go back to your comment on diversity, though, because the very nature of what you said about recruiting from Ivy League implies you're not going to get diversity.
Well, not always. I mean, there's a certain, if let's just say that, let's just picture a group of ditch diggers. Okay, so we're going to take, every kind of, all they're doing is laboring.
Okay.
I mean, if they were all high school graduates, it wouldn't be it might be diverse in terms of ethnicity and, it might not be very diverse in terms of social class.
Right.
You throw an Ivy Leaguer into the pit with them, all of a sudden it becomes more diverse. It's diversity is in relationship to something.
Right.
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 And so you can't just, that's what I keep telling my staff. You cannot do this in the abstract. It's like, how does diversity advance the mission? And there's a mission, whether it's selling, Taco Bell, or PepsiCo products,
Right.
or in the case of American foreign policy, representing the national interest. And we had a fascinating exchange with the secretary not long ago, where somebody was complaining about a policy, and the response was, well, you could just say what the president's policy is. And I turned to the secretary afterwards. I said, you could also talk to him instead of talking at him. I mean, I mean, there's this sense that, our job is simply to represent, to go down the talking point. No,
Right.
is to have a relationship with people, and if you're not willing to listen as often as you talk, then you're not very good at what you do. And that's the problem with managers. They don't listen to their employees.
That's a very good point. Well, and what I'm finding too, and this is very true in international businesses. So we'll take China and Japan as examples. I got students from both countries in my class now, and the boss is the boss, and the employees really don't even speak to the boss. They
Right.
just, yes, yes, sir. This is what, and it's a sir almost always too, by the way. Yes, sir. That's what you want, and they just go do it. The boss is not even interested in their point of view or their thoughts or suggestions they may have. They're just, yeah, and they're much more formal too. They go to work dressed like you and I dressed. Well, you still dress, it looks like, very formal. And
Yeah.
it's really enlightening for me to hear that. And I've done business in all those countries. So when I would conduct business in China or Japan, I was wearing a suit as well because that's what they wore. But they don't listen, and I think they're missing a big opportunity because I have not found any students that don't have some fabulous suggestions, no matter what their background was. And
Oh,
there's also a
absolutely.
study, Bob. There's also a study that says that the more diverse your workforce, the better the performance of the company. And I use it as an example of if I'm in a room and I'm trying to solve a problem, I'll come up with a solution eventually. But if I have a diverse group of people working on it, we're going to come up with a much better solution than Larry's solution. And I've
Yeah.
always
And,
liked that.
but you don't need diversity that fractures the sense of team,
No,
and so it's really diversity and mission together,
right,
and that is that's the part that, people focus, I think, a little bit too narrowly, and they leave out the mission thing,
right,
but I'm getting ready to go on a trip out of the country next week, and so you have to sit down and you have to think, okay, so what do we want to get out of this trip? I mean, that's the mission.
right,
What is what does a good outcome look like?
right.
And that's the same question for hiring. You know,
Exactly. Exactly.
whom do we need in this? What kind of a person do we need in this position? And if they think if they think what the product is not worth it, I mean, they could be as diverse as all get out in every other respects, but they're not a good fit for the team.
Correct. Well, along those lines, do you think as a country in the American workplace, we're making progress towards aligning mission with diversity towards the goal of meeting the overall strategic objectives of the business?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. I mean, I think that it's a process. Back in was it 1964 when they passed the Civil Rights Act?
Right.
They threw in sex as an attempt to to torpedo it, and look where we've come. And when you think about it in purely economic terms, why in heaven's name would you want to exclude more than a majority of the population from the workforce?
Right.
And the question, what are the incentives? I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting questions in terms of the value of money and how do people work because they want to or because they have to. I mean, those are all really important questions. But I always recoil a bit when people say there's only one definition of diversity. There isn't, and
Yeah.
it's all in relationship to something.
Let's talk about two things, and I'll talk about the first one first, which is we're going to see changes in what's going on in the business world. It's businesses that are going to just disappear, things that are going to disappear. I think the pandemic's driving that faster than otherwise would have occurred historically. So an example was, newspapers are almost dead. Most publications have gone out of business because people are getting everything on the internet now. They're not reading, not even reading books. If you were to go back many years, you could talk about all the things that have disappeared as a consequence. I gave a whole speech on businesses that no longer exist that went out of business in the last 10 or 15 years. So just some examples have you seen? But more importantly, what's your forecast of businesses that are going to emerge in the future? And what are the skills that you think are going to be required of those workers to be successful in those future businesses? Let's start with things that you've seen go away over time.
Well, one caution I would have about uh, the reliance on electronics is certainly what you all have experienced in California, which is power outages.
Right.
I mean, so there's always going to be a role for things written on paper. I mean, the question is how do you manage? I mean, Google the phrase Carrington event, which was a major solar flare in the 1850s that set towers on fire. There were like telephone poles, and so this whole idea of the stability of your power grid, are we just as dependent on electricity as we were on long supply chains for toilet paper? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that you need to be, that good managers get, think about.
Right.
The when we look at questions like people who are willing to kind of look at things in context. Okay, so the assumption, for example, is that China is this huge behemoth. Well, it is. There's no doubt about it. But it's also got lots of vulnerabilities that nobody ever talks about. So the person who can sometimes be a little bit of a contrarian, you want somebody in there who says, well, I mean, have you thought about this side?
Right. Stirs the pot a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's this where what everybody says, oh yeah, there's no dissent. It's like you got a problem.
Absolutely, I agree 100%.
If you don't have people saying, I don't know about that, so I think that really good writing and analytical skills, are always in demand.
I agree.
And I think they go hand in hand, because getting somebody to be able to write succinctly, is that takes a lot of practice.
Right.
I mean, very few of us are really, born writers right out of the box. And the same thing would be true with things like being able to read a spreadsheet, being able to do some statistics.
Mm-hmm.
I went all the way through law school and was never forced to take statistics.
Right.
I took dummy statistics when I was in college, but it was, but so much of what we do in law relies on being able to read spreadsheets and look at correlations and I mean there's lots of really basic skills out there that that I think they're fungible. It doesn't really make any difference. And the same thing is true as interpersonal skills. I mean, are you friendly? Do you like to go talk to people?
Yeah.
And there are certain people who are really good at it, and there are people who really aren't.
Right. Right.
But there's lots of things for them to do.
Right.
I mean, I had a colleague in the law firm say, how can you possibly get up in court and just like talk like that? She said, I would just be completely, turned into a piece of jello. I said, yeah, but you were the one who kind of put all together the whole research plan for putting together an entire credit card. I said, by the time I got to the fourth iteration of the project plan, I would have been asleep on the floor. So I mean, there are different people have different aptitudes.
Right. One of my best friends in San Francisco, who was an attorney, his name was Marty Orlick, and we were arguing an eminent domain case where the city wanted to condemn a Taco Bell property. And he's arguing before the judge, and I'm the star witness because I'm running the restaurants in San Francisco. And so Marty gets me on the stand. He said, Mr. Destro, can you tell us a little bit about Taco Bell? Well, yeah, we have 4,000 restaurants, and the judge eyes open up. He had Taco Bell. Mr. Destro, can you tell us what's a restaurant manager make for Taco Bell? And at the time, with incentives, he was making about $80,000. The judge said, "That's more than I'm making." Mr. Destro, can you tell us who owns Taco Bell? At the time, it was PepsiCo. Yeah, it's PepsiCo. Mr. Destro, can you tell us who did the last commercial for Taco Bell? Yeah, it's Michael Jackson. All of a sudden, the judge thought we were some mom and pop chain, and all of a sudden, the case went away real quick. They could not condemn our property. They realized they were coming up against somebody who wasn't going to live. But I asked Marty afterwards, because he had the gift of gab, if you will. He says, "Larry, I am a actor who never made it in acting, but I get to do it in law."
Well, it's funny. I mean, I have a similar story. My only eminent domain case was a case called United States versus .033 acres of land.
0.003.
Yeah. And it was they were doing the Cuyahoga Valley National Park in northeastern Ohio, and it was they wanted to condemn an electric tower that on which a high tension wire went from southern Ohio up to Cleveland. And of course, if you condemn the tower and you force them to move the tower, you'd have to relocate the line.
Right.
And so, and they would say, well, no, we only have to pay for the land. We don't have to do the line. And so it was it was a blisteringly hot day outside. And so we're in the courtroom and I'm watching the partner make the argument, and we all go out, and the judge says, "I'll take it under advisement." And he goes, and he kind of jabs me in the ribs and says, "Watch this." And so he goes over to the attorneys for the Sierra Club, who were sitting, on the, waiting in the window. He goes, "God, is it hot?" "Oh yeah." He says, "Wouldn't you just love to go home, put your feet up in front of the air conditioner, flip it on, open up a cold beer, and just lay back?" And they go, he goes, "Yeah, that sounds great." He goes, "Well, where the hell do you think the electricity is going to come from?" And they don't train you for that. I mean, but
exactly. Quick on your feet and a little bit of a penchant for acting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the litigators do.
Yeah. And Marty was really good at it. He was really good.
But some of the most creative lawyers out there, and I've done some research on this when I was the dean, and some of the most creative lawyers out there are the tax lawyers.
Really?
You don't think that. You think accountant, right? They come up with these like amazing structures they can hide income in. So it's very, very interesting.
That's amazing. Well, is there any insights that we haven't kind of covered along the way here, Bob, that you'd like to share with the class in terms of the American workforce, just from your point of view?
Not really. I think we've covered most of it. I mean, if you just kind of treat you're not dealing with a workforce, you're dealing with a group of people.
Right.
And if you keep that in mind, you can be a pretty good manager as long as you like people.
Right.
If you don't like people, then, do something else.
Don't be a manager.
Right. Exactly.
Be an individual contributor. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Bob. It was a real pleasure.